In the autumn of 1887, the town of Caldera Flat in southern Nevada had almost nothing left to argue about. The Mineral Crown Hotel had burned to its foundation stones in July, and by September the lot had been seized for unpaid tax debt and placed before the county auctioneer on a dry Thursday morning when the wind came off the alkali flats tasting of salt and old ash. The town itself had been diminishing for the better part of a decade. The silver seam that had called 1,200 people to this basin in 1875 having thinned to a trickle by 1883, and what remained was the ordinary residue of a place that had once believed itself permanent. 2 saloons, a hardware concern, an assay office, a dry goods store, a livery, a church with a damaged steeple, and the blackened outline of a hotel that had once been the finest structure between Tonopah and the California line. Nora Voss was 27 years old and had arrived in Caldera Flat 11 days earlier with $43, a leather document satchel worn thin at one corner, and a mason's trade she had learned from her grandfather over the course of 9 years in a limestone quarry outside Santa Fe. She had no connections in the county, no family within 400 miles, and no interest in the sympathy of strangers. She had come because she had heard there was work surveying old mine shafts near the Caldera Range, and because she needed to be somewhere that was not the town she had left. She attended the auction because she had nothing else to do on a Thursday morning, and because standing still in unfamiliar country had always made her uneasy. She was a precise and observant woman who had learned to trust the things she could measure and the things her hands could tell her, which were, in her experience, more reliable than most of what people chose to tell each other. She wore her dark hair up beneath a practical hat and carried herself with the slightly forward lean of someone accustomed to examining surfaces at close range. The survey work had given her arms that were stronger than they looked, and a patience for detail that she had come to think of not as a virtue but as a tool, no different from the chisels in her satchel, something to be kept sharp and applied with deliberate force at the right moment. The lot drew 4 bidders. 2 were speculators from Reno who had ridden down on a rumor about railroad expansion and who lost interest the moment they walked the property and found nothing but a charcoal footprint, a broken chimney stack, and a surviving root cellar set into a low rise at the rear of the lot. One of them kicked at a blackened timber end with his boot and said something to the other that Nora did not catch, and they both laughed in the loose, private way of men who are certain they are the only people present worth addressing. The third bidder was the owner of a hardware concern on the main street, who wanted the land for a storage warehouse, and who opened at $3 and promptly had his nerve fail him when one of the Reno men laughed at the rubble. Nora bid $1. No one countered. The auctioneer marked the deed and handed it to her with the expression of a man who has just sold a dead horse. He didn't meet her eyes when he handed her the paper. He folded his book and moved on to the next item, a wagon frame without wheels, and Nora walked away from the small assembly of onlookers with the deed in her satchel and the lot at her back, and the Reno men had already lost interest in her and were talking about the stage times to Carson City. She had bought what she could afford. She had not yet decided whether it was anything more than ground to stand on while she waited for the survey work to materialize. If you have ever stood inside something that was once full of human life and is now only ash and silence, you will understand what a burned building gives back to the land around it. Stay with this story a while, because what the ash gave back in this case was something no fire had thought to reach. She spent the first afternoon walking the perimeter, not the ruin. Her grandfather had taught her that a site tells you its history in its edges before it tells you anything in its center, and she had found this to be true for quarry faces, for old walls, and for the ground itself. The lot was 40 feet wide and ran back 90 feet from the street. The hotel had occupied the front 60 feet. The rear 30 feet sloped away from the ruin in a long, shallow grade, and ended at a low earthen rise, about chest high, from which the root cellar's plank door had been accessible before the fire. The plank door was gone now. In its place, visible from 20 feet away once she walked around the rise, was a flat wall of dry-stacked limestone block, mortared with what appeared to be a hydraulic cement, poured in a rough band at the top and bottom courses, the face of it smooth and pale against the darker earth of the rise. Nora stood before the bricked face for a long time. Her grandfather, Thomas Voss, had taught her to read mortar the way a ferryman reads water. Not all mortars behave the same. Common lime mortar cures slowly, stays somewhat yielding, and weathers from the face inward across decades. It is the mortar of ordinary construction, mixed on site from slaked lime and clean sand, reliable across a broad range of applications and forgiving of small imprecisions in the mixing. You could date a lime mortar joint within a reasonable range by its color, its hardness to a thumbnail, and the degree to which it had receded from the face of the stone. Nora had done this dozens of times in the survey work, establishing the approximate age of boundary walls and claim markers where the records had been lost or disputed. Hydraulic cement was different. It activates in the presence of moisture and cures hard as stone within days, was a newer material in the 1880s, more expensive and almost never used for incidental work such as sealing a root cellar. It was used where permanence was required, where a seal was meant to hold against pressure or intrusion, where the person doing the work wanted to be certain the work would not undo itself. Tomas had used it twice in his career, once for a bridge abutment on the Rio Chama, and once for a cistern wall in a dry country estate outside Taos. Each time he had explained to her that hydraulic cement was not a material you reached for when you were in a hurry to finish a job. It was a material you reached for when you were in a hurry to make certain something would not be found. The pale band of it at the top and bottom courses of the brick doorway was, to her trained eye, unmistakable. She pressed her thumbnail against the face of the mortar in the upper course and felt the characteristic resistance of a fully cured hydraulic set, solid as the stone around it. She ran her finger along the joint between the second and third courses from the top, where lime mortar would have shown a hairline recession from weather and settling, and found it flush and tight. The material was expensive and deliberate, and out of all proportion to the task of sealing a root cellar on a hotel lot that no one of significance was paying attention to. The hotel had burned in July. The sealing of this door had been done no earlier than the previous spring, Nora judged, by the appearance of the mortar face, which meant it had been done while the hotel was still standing and in operation, which meant someone had sealed this cellar deliberately with the material chosen for permanence, while the hotel above it was conducting ordinary business. She did not return to her rented room that evening to think this through. She walked to the county recorder's office before it closed at 5 and asked for the ownership history of the Mineral Crown Hotel lot. The clerk, a compact man named Ridley who wore his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow regardless of weather, found the file after a few minutes and told her that the hotel had been owned since 1879 by a company called the Western Territorial Properties Concern, registered in the state of California, with a local agent of record named Aldous Crane, who maintained a law office on the 3rd Street. Ridley told her this without particular interest, the way a man tells a stranger the time. Nora noted it, thanked him, and walked back to the lot as the last light left the sky. She owned a set of cold chisels her grandfather had given her the autumn before he died. 3 of them, each a different width, each kept sharp on an Arkansas stone she carried wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of her satchel. The widest was 1.25 inches across the blade, and she used it for splitting and broad removal work. The middle chisel was 3/4 inch, a general-purpose tool that handled most of what the survey work required. The narrowest was a half-inch point chisel, beveled on both faces, and it was the one Tomas had prized above the others because of what it could do at an interface, at the seam between two different materials where each behaved by its own law. This was the chisel she was thinking about as she stood before the brick doorway. She owned a 14-pound short-handed sledge that she had acquired at a farm auction in Tucson for 60 cents, and a brass mallet for finer percussion work, and a spirit level she carried in a padded leather sleeve. These were her working tools, and she had used them for 2 years in the survey work that took her across the territory, chipping core samples from canyon walls and cutting witness marks into stone faces for claim boundaries. She knew how a chisel behaved against different materials, the way a good rider knows how a horse behaves on different ground. She did not begin the work that evening. She studied the wall in the last light instead, touching the mortar face with her fingertips, reading the set of the stone courses, finding the place where the seal was thinnest, which was at the upper left corner where the rise of the earthen bank had not allowed proper tooling. Then she went back to her room and slept. A problem examined in good light is a different problem than the one you carry into sleep, and a different one again when you wake. By morning, she had a clear picture of the approach. The upper left corner, the narrowest chisel at an oblique angle to exploit the interface, lateral rather than direct force so the blocks were not fractured, working from the outer bond inward in a progression of short strokes. She had done this work before, in different forms, on quarry faces and mine portals. The material was different. The principle was the same. The next morning she was at the cellar face at 6 o'clock with a tin lantern lit and hanging from a stake she had driven into the bank above her. Hydraulic cement, for all its virtues of permanence, has one quality that a working mason learns to respect. It bonds densely to itself, but it does not bond with the same tenacity to older, drier stone that has already cured and settled. The interface between the new mortar and the old limestone blocks behind it is always somewhat weaker than either material alone. If you work a thin chisel into that interface at an angle and apply lateral force rather than direct percussion, the new mortar will eventually separate cleanly from the old stone without fracturing the block. It is slow work, and it requires a light hand, and it requires that you read the stone carefully so you do not drive the chisel into a plane that will fracture the block rather than the bond. Her grandfather had called this kind of work listening work because the chisel was telling you something with every strike, and you needed to hear it. She worked for 6 hours on the first day. The sun came over the Caldera Range at 7, and by 8 it was at her back, warming the bank and the limestone blocks, and raising a faint smell of old plaster from the mortar face as it dried further in the direct heat. She worked with her hat pulled low, and the sleeves of her dress rolled and pinned above the elbow, the narrow chisel in her left hand, the brass mallet in her right, driving the chisel into the interface between the hydraulic seal and the old dry limestone block with measured even strokes, each stroke placed to follow the previous, working along the grain of the bond rather than across it. The mortar came away in sections ranging from a thumb's width to a hand's width, each piece set aside in the order it came off so she could reconstruct the face if she needed to. The work was slow. It was meant to be slow. The block behind the mortar was the original construction, laid in 1879, and she had no interest in cracking it. She had 12 years of practice in not cracking the thing behind the thing she was working on. By the time the afternoon heat drove her back from the bank, she had cleared perhaps 8 inches along the top course and could feel a change in the air at the gap, not a draft, a presence. Cold air, held and still, the way air inside a sealed space holds itself for years, accumulating a chill that has nothing to do with the season outside. She had felt this once before, opening a sealed mine drift near Silver City. And the sensation was one she had not forgotten. The specific quality of old enclosed air meeting, moving air for the first time, the momentary equilibrium before the sealed atmosphere dissipates. It meant the space on the other side was intact. No settling had breached the walls. No moisture had found a path through the floor. Whatever was in there had been sitting, undisturbed, in the condition in which it had been placed. She did not widen the gap. She sealed it again with a temporary plug of dampened clay she packed from the bank itself and went back to her room. She ate her supper in her room and wrote 3 columns of observations in the survey notebook she always kept. 1 column for what she had seen, 1 for what she had inferred, and 1 for what she still did not know. The 3rd column was the longest. She returned to the county recorder's office that afternoon and asked Ridley for the hotel's original construction permits from 1879. He found them after 20 minutes in a back cabinet. The permits listed the construction contractor as a firm called Sanger & Webb, which had built the hotel in 8 months. The permits also listed the cellar, described as a root and spirits storage cellar, 18 feet by 22 feet, finished with a fieldstone floor and fitted with pine shelving. Standard hotel infrastructure for 1879. Nothing unusual in the filing. She asked whether there was a filing for any subsequent alteration to the cellar. Ridley looked with more effort this time, working through a second cabinet of amendment filings. There was nothing. No permit for the brick door. No permit for any modification to the cellar after the original construction, which meant either no permit had been pulled, which was not unusual for minor work, or the work had been done without anyone's knowledge beyond the person who ordered it. She thanked Ridley and walked 3 blocks to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the Santa Fe recorder's office asking whether a Western Territorial Properties concern was registered there and whether an Aldous Crane was associated with any property filings in the county. The reply came the following morning. Western Territorial Properties concern was registered in Santa Fe as well as California. Aldous Crane was listed as agent of record on 11 property filings in Santa Fe County, spanning the years 1873 to 1882. 6 of those filings were for properties that had subsequently been seized by the territory for non-payment of tax obligation. The remaining 5 had been sold at auction to a separate entity, the Nevada Land and Resource Company, whose registered address matched exactly the same California post office box as the Western Territorial Properties concern. Nora read the telegraph reply sitting on the bench outside the office, and she sat there for a while without moving. The Alkali Flats were visible at the end of the main street, pale and still in the late morning light, and the range beyond them was the color of old iron. A wagon went past with a load of lumber, and 2 men talking over the driver's bench, and a dog crossed the street with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a dog that owned the street and knew it. She was thinking about the same California post office box. Her grandfather had told her once, when she was 16, and puzzling over a discrepancy in the survey marks on a quarry boundary, that the most reliable sign of buried trouble was not the discrepancy itself, but the neatness of the paperwork surrounding it. Honest mistakes leave a ragged trail. Deliberate ones leave a trail that is almost too tidy, too consistent, too perfectly resolved on the surface because the person making the mistake was also making the record. He had shown her this on the quarry boundary, pointing to 3 separate sets of survey marks that all agreed with each other exactly, and all contradicted the original deed description by a precise and consistent 8 feet. And he had said that 8 feet was not an honest measurement error. It was an honest-looking one, and that the difference between the 2 was the thing worth understanding. She had been 16. She had not yet known how often she would use this piece of knowledge. She went back to the cellar face on the second morning with a plan that had clarified overnight. The pattern from the Santa Fe filings was not proof of anything by itself. It was a signature. What was in the cellar was either evidence or it was not, and she would not know which until she was inside. The work went faster on the second day because she had already broken the bond along the top course and could now run her smallest chisel along the first vertical joint on the left side, separating the seal from the jamstones. By noon, she had the upper left quadrant of the wall free, a section roughly 2 feet wide and 2 feet tall, and she could see into the space beyond by the light of her lantern. She did not go in yet. She knelt at the gap and let the air come out past her, and she looked. The cellar was intact. The pine shelving was intact. The fieldstone floor was intact. The roof of it, which she could now see was a low barrel vault of brick laid in lime mortar, was sound and uncracked, which explained why the fire above had not sent the vault down. A layer of fine pale dust lay over every flat surface, the kind of dust that accumulates in a sealed room over months rather than years, which confirmed her estimate of the sealing date. The lantern light fell across the nearest section of shelving and showed her the grain of the pine boards gone silver with age, and the dust lying on them in a smooth and undisturbed plane. Nothing disturbed, nothing displaced. On the shelving to the left, she could see the shapes of bottles, a case of them, still upright, their labels darkened with age, and their corks still seated. On the shelving to the right, stacked flat and tied with cord, were what appeared to be ledger books, perhaps a dozen of them, their spines facing the wall so she could not read the labels from the gap. And at the far end of the cellar, on the fieldstone floor, were 2 iron strongboxes, each about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, sitting side by side against the base of the far wall with a deliberateness that spoke of placement rather than storage. Someone had not merely put things in this cellar. Someone had arranged it. She enlarged the gap over the next 2 hours until it was wide enough to enter, removing the blocks with care and stacking them against the bank in sequence, each block numbered in chalk on its face so she could replace it correctly. She crawled through with her lantern at 4 in the afternoon. The air inside was dry and cool, and had the quality of held things, of a room that had been waiting. It smelled of pine and old paper, and the particular mineral neutrality of stone that has been sealed from weather. She stood up inside it and held the lantern at arm's length and turned slowly, reading the whole of it before she touched anything. The ledger books were bound in dark cloth and labeled on their spines in a small, precise hand. Nora read the labels without touching the books for a full minute. They bore dates spanning 1879 to 1887, and they were labeled not by the name of the hotel, but by county names, Nevada county names, 6 of them, the same 6 counties in which, she already suspected, properties had been filed by entities that shared their address with Western Territorial Properties Concern. She pulled the earliest ledger from the shelf, the 1879 volume, and opened it on the fieldstone floor with her lantern beside her. It was an accounts ledger, not the hotel's accounts. It was a record of property transactions, each entry precise and dated, recording the acquisition price, the assessed value, the tax obligation, the date of the last payment, and beside each entry, in red ink that had not faded, a notation in the same small hand that had labeled the spines. The notation was a name in each case, a surname, the name of the party who had originally sold or leased the property to the concern. The handwriting was consistent across all entries, the hand of a single person, small and economical and trained, the hand of someone who had written a great deal in a professional capacity and had developed an efficient and personal script that was still fully legible. And beside each name, in some entries but not all, a second notation, a dollar figure much smaller than the acquisition price, marked with a single letter R. She did not know yet what the R stood for. She sat with the lantern beside her and worked through the ledger slowly, reading every entry, turning back to re-examine entries she had already read when later entries added context, the way you read a contract rather than a letter, attending to the pattern as much as the individual line. The field stone floor was cold under her, and the vault above her was lower than she was tall, and she had to keep her shoulders slightly rounded to work in the space, but she did not notice any of this particularly. Her attention was on the ledger. By the time she reached the middle of the 1879 volume, she had a count of 47 transactions, and a pattern so clear it made the cold air of the cellar feel colder. The acquisition prices were uniformly far below assessed value, in some cases as little as 20 cents on the assessed dollar, but never so uniformly low as to constitute an obvious fraud on its face. The R notations appeared in 22 of the 47 entries and were uniformly small, uniformly round numbers, uniformly paid to names that were different from the original sellers. $10 in one case, 20 in another, 50 in a third, the amounts varying in a way that suggested they were calibrated to something, to the size of the transaction or the nature of the certification required, though she could not yet say which. The ledger was a record not just of transactions, but of a system. Someone had been buying properties at fractions of their assessed value from sellers who needed quick money, and in 22 cases, something else had been paid to someone else for a purpose the single letter did not name, but the pattern suggested clearly enough. A payment that was small enough to be unremarkable and large enough to be meaningful. A payment that was recorded here and nowhere else. She stayed in the cellar until the lantern needed refilling. She came out at dusk and sat on the bank above the sealed door and let the evening air work on her. She did not open the strongboxes that day. She sealed the gap again with her temporary clay plug and went to find the one person in Caldera Flat she had already determined knew more about Aldous Crane and the Western Territorial Properties concern than anyone else in the county. His name was Cal Marsh, and he ran a small assay office on the western end of the main street, and he had been in Caldera Flat since 1876. He was 61 years old, built close to the ground, with hands that had been stained permanently by mineral acids, and a face that had been weathered by 11 years of Nevada sun into something resembling a good piece of dried hickory. He had been one of the original creditors when the Mineral Crown Hotel's debts came due, which Nora had learned from a public notice posted in the county clerk's window, and his claim had been discharged at a rate of 14 cents on the dollar at the tax seizure. He had not hidden his opinion of this outcome. She found him at his bench, working a crucible, and she waited until he was finished before she spoke. She told him who she was, and that she had purchased the hotel lot and had found the cellar intact. She did not tell him what was in it yet. She asked him instead what he knew about Aldous Crane. Cal Marsh set down his crucible tongs and looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been waiting a fair amount of time for a particular question to be asked. He told her that Aldous Crane had come to the county in 1882 as the agent for a California land company and had within 3 years acquired interests in 11 properties across southern Nevada, all of them acquired from families or small operators who were in financial difficulty and needed immediate cash. The acquisition prices had been honest in appearance, he said, but the terms had in several cases included provisions that made the sellers liable for certain costs after the sale, costs that had been obscure in the original contract language, costs that had resulted in several of the sellers leaving the county with less than they believed they had been paid. He knew this because 2 of those sellers had come to him afterward, after Crane's dealings had reached a stage he could only describe as complete, and because he had helped 2 of the families file a complaint with the Territorial Land Commission in Carson City in 1885. The complaint had been dismissed for lack of documentary evidence. He said this last sentence without any particular expression, and then he picked up his tongs again. Nora told him she had found ledger books in the cellar. She told him how many and the date range, and she told him about the transactions and the pattern and the R notation. Cal Marsh put down his tongs again. He did not speak for almost a minute. Then he said quietly that the two families who had come to him had each mentioned in the telling of their situations that someone had been present at their closings who was not Crane and who was not identified on any document, but who had spoken briefly and privately with Crane before the final papers were signed, and who had afterward, in both cases, received a payment from Crane in the seller's presence, a payment the sellers had taken as ordinary business between agents. A retainer, Crane had called it, paid to a county surveyor's deputy who had certified the property boundary on short notice. She asked his name. Cal Marsh said he did not know the man's surname. He had been described as a deputy with the county land office, and he had stopped working at the county land office sometime in 1885 or 1886, and no one Cal had spoken to had been able to say where he had gone. Nora thought about the ledger entries, 22 R notations, 22 round numbers. A deputy with a certification authority who had appeared at closings, accepted a payment, and vanished from the county records. She went back to the cellar the next morning and opened it fully for the first time, removing enough blocks to make a proper entrance and setting the lantern inside on the fieldstone floor. She examined the strong boxes. They were padlocked, both of them with drop-shackle locks she recognized as manufactured by a Connecticut firm that had been selling to the Western Territories since the 1870s. Her grandfather had kept one of these locks on his tool chest for 30 years, and she had watched him work the mechanism open with a bent wire on 3 occasions when the key had been mislaid. She had the lock on the first box open in 11 minutes. The second required 15. The first box held currency, paper notes and coin, amounting to what she counted as approximately $4,200. She did not count it twice. She set it aside and opened the second box. The second box held documents, not ledgers, individual papers folded and bundled in tied packets organized by county, the same 6 counties as the ledger volumes on the shelf. Each packet contained, in each case she opened, the original signed contracts for the property transactions recorded in the ledgers, along with a separate document in each bundle that bore the stamp of the county land office and the signature of a deputy certifying the boundary survey. The name on the certification stamp was the same in every bundle. His name was printed clearly under his signature. Leonard Pruitt, Deputy Surveyor, Esmeralda County, Nevada. Nora sat on the fieldstone floor of the sealed cellar with the lantern burning beside her and 22 bundled contracts in her lap, and she thought about what Thomas Voss had told her the last summer before he died, when she had asked him what he thought honest work was worth in a world that did not always pay honest prices for it. He had considered this for a long time, the way he considered everything. And then he had said that the worth of honest work was not the price it fetched, but the thing it left behind. And that the thing it left behind was always a cleaner set of facts than it had found. She had not been certain she understood this at 25. She understood it now. She spent the rest of that day and the following morning writing out, in her own hand, a summary of what the ledger books recorded, keyed by transaction date and entry number, with the R notations flagged and the contract bundles cross-referenced. She wrote it in duplicate carefully on paper she purchased from the Caldera Flat Dry Goods store, and she included in the summary a description of the cellar itself, the conditions of sealing, her estimate of the sealing date, and a record of how she had accessed the space. She was not making a legal argument. She was making a clear set of facts, the kind a land commission or a territorial court could follow without relying on her interpretation. Cal Marsh co-signed the summary as a witness to the contents, and he added a statement of his own in his compressed, acidic hand, describing what the two families had told him in 1885. He did not ask her what she intended to do with it. He had already understood. She carried the summary and the contract bundles in one of the ledger books, chosen to represent the range of dates and counties, to the Territorial Land Commission office in Tonopah, a journey of 2 days by stage. She left the remaining ledger books and the strong boxes in the care of Cal Marsh, who locked them in his assay safe behind his bench, and told her that his assay safe had a better lock than anything Aldous Crane's estate had ever owned. The Territorial Land Commission received her filing on November the 3rd. The clerk there was a younger man than Ridley, more formal in manner, who read her summary with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting to receive exactly this kind of filing without having known it. He asked her 3 clarifying questions about the R notation and the certification bundles, each of which she answered from the summary, and then he stamped the filing received and gave her a copy, and told her that the commission would issue subpoenas within 60 days for the ledger volumes and the strongbox contents as formal evidence. Aldous Crane, Nora learned later, had departed Nevada for California several weeks after the hotel fire and had not returned. The filing reached him through a California court in the following spring. Leonard Pruitt, who had in fact not left the territory, but had simply changed counties and was working under his given name as a ranch hand near Winnemucca, was served by the commission's agent in December. The proceedings that followed consumed most of the following year and were conducted entirely in administrative offices and committee rooms, with no drama and no confrontation. Only the slow, methodical accounting of a record that had been sealed in a bricked cellar while a building burned above it, as if whoever had placed it there had understood that the fire was meant to end it, and had decided at the last possible moment that it should not be. This was the detail Nora returned to most in the months that followed. Not the ledgers, not the currency, not the locked boxes, the sealed door. Someone had known what was in that cellar. Someone had bricked that door with hydraulic cement chosen for permanence before the fire was set. Not to hide it from her because she was not yet in the county. To hide it from Aldous Crane. She never discovered who had sealed it. The hotel had employed a staff of 7 at its peak, and by the time the fire swept through in July of 1887, only 2 remained. One had died in the fire. The other, a housekeeper named Dora Farwell who had worked at the Mineral Crown since its opening in 1879, had left Caldera Flat the morning after the fire with no forwarding address and had not been located by the time the commission's proceedings concluded. Nora thought about Dora Farwell sometimes, about what it took to seal a door, alone, in the days before a fire you knew was coming, carrying the weight of what was inside and the knowledge that you would not be the one to open it. About the specific and permanent nature of the choice of cement. The commission's findings resulted in the restoration of 4 properties to the heirs of original sellers who could be located, the transfer of 2 additional properties to a public trust administered by the territorial government for the benefit of families who could not, and the recovery of the currency from the strongbox, which, after commission fees, was distributed in partial satisfaction of debts the Western Territorial Properties Concern had left outstanding across the 6 counties, including Cal Marsh's discharge claim, which was settled at 81 cents on the dollar rather than 14. Cal Marsh received the settlement draft in February of 1889. He did not say much when he read it. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to his bench. Nora wasn't present for the formal proceedings. She had filed her evidence and her summary, and had answered the commission's written inquiries by correspondence, and had then gone back to work, There was survey work in the canyon country north of Tonopah, and she had spent the winter months doing it, camping at night in a canvas lean-to with her satchel for a pillow and her grandfather's chisels wrapped in oiled cloth at her side. She returned to Caldera Flat once, in the spring of 1889, not for any proceeding, but because she had a piece of business she had left unfinished. She had retained from the strongbox, at the Commission's written permission, a single document, the earliest of the R notation contracts, dated September of 1879, which bore at the bottom of the last page, below all the signatures, a line of text in the small, precise hand she had come to recognize as Aldous Crane's, a line that read, in full, accounts settled and complete, all obligations discharged, which was the kind of language a careful man used when he wanted to be certain no one would come looking afterward. She did not keep this document for herself. She had it copied at the county clerk's office in Tonopah, with a cover note stating its provenance and its relation to the Commission's findings, and then she carried the original to the Santa Fe recorder's office herself on a trip south that June, where it was filed as a supplementary exhibit to the Territorial Commission's formal record, and where it would sit, she was told, in perpetuity, available to any subsequent inquiry. On her way back through Caldera Flat, she stopped at the lot and walked the perimeter once, as she had done on the first afternoon. The ruin was unchanged. The chimney stack still stood at its odd angle. The fieldstone floor of the cellar was still visible through the open entrance, the pine shelving still intact. The limestone blocks she had removed stacked neatly against the bank where she had left them the previous autumn. Someone had placed a single bunch of dried sage on the fieldstone floor inside the entrance, tied with a strip of cloth the color of old linen. She did not know who had put it there. She thought about Dora Farwell. She stood at the entrance for a long time, not speaking, not moving, holding her grandfather's smallest chisel in her right hand, because she had been using it to mark a claim boundary 2 miles north and had not yet put it away. The metal of it was warm from her grip and familiar as her own name. She had come into this place with nothing but $1 and a trade and whatever Thomas Foss had put in her hands, and she had found that these were sufficient, not generous, not more than was needed. Sufficient. She set the chisel down on the fieldstone beside the dried sage, and then she picked it back up again, because a working tool does not belong on a floor. It belongs in the hand that knows how to use it. She walked back to the stage road. The Alkali Flats were pale in the late morning light, and the Caldera Range beyond them was the color of old iron, and the sky above it was the clear, unsparing blue of a Nevada autumn that makes no promises about what it is keeping. If you have ever held on to a piece of work someone told you was worthless, you know how this story ends. Tell us below what you would have done with that sealed door. And if you want another story about a woman and a place the world wrote off too soon, there is one waiting for you.